What if your electric vehicle could point you to the most reliable charging stop before you even hit the road? In this episode, Dave Rench McCauley, co-founder and CEO of roadtripAI, introduces product Selene, the AI copilot that optimizes roads, manages charging stops, support drivers, and fleets in real time. Dave also shares his journey from physics and AI expertise to launching a startup, along with the challenges, breakthroughs, and vision behind Roadtrip AI. Hello, Dave.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you? Thank you for joining me.
No, I appreciate the invite.
Dave, before we dive into your startup, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your journey? What shaped your path from physics and AI into your own startup company?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. So my career path has been very circuitous, very winding. I actually have a talk I sometimes give to students in college that's entitled "Sometimes the best career path is a winding one." To try to give them the idea of what options they have. So I actually started college with the expectation that I would be doing opera performance. I'm a classically trained singer, and that was like music is deep in the background of my parents and my family. But ultimately, found that it was not a space in which, frankly, if I was being honest with myself, I would be able to stand on the world stage successfully and earn a decent living. So I switched to my other passion, which had developed in high school, which was physics, because those two are naturally yin and yang, right? Um, a lot of successful singers have a science and math background, and vice versa. Actually, it's not talked about that much. But anyways, I did physics as an undergrad, and then I went on to continue doing it a PhD in experimental physics, condensed matter specifically. And then I pivoted that expertise, which in the R&D space, I was finding to be a little too slow of a burn to have the kind of impact on society that I was hoping for. I pivoted that into a policy career where I went to work for the federal government under a fellowship program made for scientists called for the U.S. Department of Energy, specifically in the Solar Energy Technologies Office. And that's where I got my exposure to climate tech and climate change mitigation issues that we focus on now in Road Trip AI from the electric vehicles angle. While I was there, I got to work on such a huge range of things for that market that it was mind-boggling: workforce development, semiconductor reliability, but ultimately, some of our most interesting and illuminating projects came from the machine learning and artificial intelligence space. And while I was there, I managed those projects, but I didn't have a really strong background in it. So I took night classes online and taught myself to the point where I was actually more interested in pursuing a path as a data scientist in the startup space than I was in staying in government. So I left after about 5 years in the solar office and joined a startup called Kinetica, where I learned about really large data sets, really high velocity volume data science, and then parlayed that into setting up the data science and AI practice for a small consultancy, which eventually got acquired by Ernst and Young, which is what I do, sort of a part-time gig right now, is technology consulting for them. On the other side, though, years passed in this telling that I just did really quickly of my career path. And I started getting the yearning to both be more hands-on with technology again than I can currently do in my consulting capacity, but also to go back into climate tech. And electric vehicles were primed for a renaissance, especially because of federal incentives that were coming out at the time. And this was back in late 2022, early 2023. And it seemed like a perfect opportunity for someone who wanted to work in artificial intelligence, continuing that kind of work, but also in a space that climate tech had lots of data and lots of interesting use cases for.
Thank you. For someone who has never heard of about Selene, how do you explain what it does and in simple way, what it is,
Yeah,
why it matters, and who it's for?
sure. So Selene is our flagship product for Road Trip AI. Basically, the story goes that in 2023, my wife and I purchased our first battery electric vehicle, so all electric. And it was a Volkswagen ID.4, currently the same vehicle for our family of five. So we have three small kids. And it turned out very quickly, I realized that this was an industry that was like on the ups, electric vehicles, but that it was also plagued by a lot of little problems that sort of built up to a really big problem for any given consumer. So in particular, the problems we were facing was that public charging can be extremely unreliable for non-Tesla drivers, in particular in the United States. 1 out of every 4 plugs in public charging have been documented as being down at any given moment in time in the US. And most charging stations only have about 4 plugs. So that's 1 plug for you 1 plug for everybody that won't work, and then potentially a line forming for the ones that do work. So we looked around for solutions in this space and found a few products out there that would take you to the nearest chargers and give you a little bit of information about cost or whatever, but nothing that would both route you long distances, because Americans are very afraid of taking their EVs on road trips right now due to the charging situation, what's called charger anxiety, understandably so, which is causing a lot of people to hold back on their adoption of the vehicles in the first place. And then also not only routing long distances, but finding not just chargers when you need them, but high reliability chargers, what we call it road trip a P charge, or probability of a successful charge. So basically what I wanted to do was marry the two concepts of, not only am I going to find you juice when you need it on the road on a long trip, but I'm going to give you the best possible experience by picking stations using the data that we've developed in our underlying algorithms that are going to give you the best chance of success when you arrive, so you don't just get there and still have a bad experience because you picked the wrong one or whatever. Right now it's sort of a blind exercise for most other products that we do as part of our algorithm to find the highest reliability spots. As we were doing that, we learned things about not just individual drivers like ourselves, but also about electrified fleets of vehicles for commercial entities, especially small to medium businesses, and how much they would tend to struggle with the electrification question. You know, when and how should I transition my vehicles from gas vehicles to electric vehicles, if ever? And one problem we found there was that usually that transition is a multi-pronged, complicated one. Not only do you have to buy new vehicles and switch them out for the old ones, which is a little bit difficult. Not only are electric vehicles, as we found for individual drivers, but also for fleets, more tricky in some ways for drivers, because they're heavily software-defined vehicles, as we call them, and they tend to have features that people haven't seen before in gas vehicles that make for a confusing driving experience at times. Not only those two things, but for fleets, you also have to have your own or some sort of privately provided solution for charging usually. So there's things called fleet or charging as a service, but there's also a lot of places that have to opt into installing electronics in their depots for their vehicles to be able to charge them successfully. And we thought it was kind of silly that these entities that were taking a big leap already to electrifying their vehicles also had to worry about these infrastructure issues along the way. And so we talked to some folks in the space and found a partner, a recycling company called Sustainably, that was particularly interested in helping us co-design a solution that would help their small fleet basically not have to worry about installing charging of their own, but rather leverage the public charging network and the data and algorithms we had built to be able to more efficiently go on longer routes without worrying about having to return back. So in their case, they have a sort of a co-working warehouse situation where they get a small piece of a warehouse that's also leased out to other parties. And as a result, they have no ability to install their own charging, even if it's possible to do so. So they just rely on a 3-prong outlet to charge their vehicle that takes a really long time to charge up. Usually about 2 to 3 miles per hour of charging range is added with that setup. What they wanted to do is they said, we currently can only service the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I'm based, and we can't leave the DC metro very effectively because we're concerned about range. We've also tried to use public charging solutions before, and sometimes they're in parking garages where our tall vans can't actually access because of clearance restrictions. And then we're really in trouble if we thought we could charge. We get there and it's not actually possible. So what they asked us was, is it possible to use what you're giving to drivers already to use for personal vehicles, but to use it for fleet route optimization, and to layer in public charging as an option, so we don't have to build our own charging right now. We ideally can get more customers serviced without having to buy a new vehicle, which is a high upfront cost in the EV space especially. And we can sort of just do a smooth transition to electrification or expanding our electric fleet compared to the more abrupt typical approach that happens today. And so it wasn't very difficult to pivot the technology to be able to address that situation. Today, Sustainably is our first and also happiest customer within our portfolio. And we're able to help them with a variety of things, including not just charger finding, which is where we started, but also some aspects of leveraging Selene, our underlying AI model, to do things like help them diagnose when problems happen with their vehicles and troubleshoot solutions that may not even require them to take the vehicle into a service provider, but can just do it themselves on site very quickly.
Thank you. And how long have you been working on it? And what is the product now? What stage now?
Well, we've been working on it. We incorporated the company about a year ago now, August of 2024. And we've been working on it basically since that point for the personal driver use case. And then we started expanding into the fleet use case, I think around March of 2025. So the core product in one form or another has been under development for maybe, I don't know, about 6 months at this point, although the fleets element is more about 3 months old right now.
hmm And I saw your wonderful pitch deck. So, and can you, for our listeners, could you walk us through the customer journey for each? What does the driver's experience look like, and how does it differ from fleet's clients?
Yeah, it's similar to what I was alluding to in my previous answers. Basically, individual drivers have a high pain point when it happens, which is usually associated with long trips and trying to find reliable charging on a trip to somewhere they've never been in particular. And if they cross through certain parts of the country, frankly, the coasts, the East and West Coast, have a lot of charging options, but the Midwest does not, or the Southwest for that matter. Southwest is a little bit more populated with chargers, but not much more. So if you venture anywhere off the coasts, you can be a little more challenged often, especially again if you're working with other networks. But for them, it was largely that long trip scenario, and then along the way, we would do customer discovery interviews to like sort of validate some of our ideas by like basically camping out at public charging stations and interviewing people when they stop to charge. The funny thing was, a lot of people didn't want to talk to us initially, but then when they inevitably had trouble getting the charger to work, we would come in and offer to help them troubleshoot. And then once they were successfully charging, they were happy to answer our questions, as you can imagine, which sort of was kind of a fun way to validate some of our hypothesis about reliability and charging being a real issue, while also becoming a good interview start tactic, if you will. But it was also nice to just be able to help people, of course. But one thing we heard a lot from them, implicitly and explicitly, was that there was enough similarities with electric vehicles and the gas vehicles they were used to that they came into the experience of EV driving expecting it to be a one-to-one. So expecting that their first public charge would be a 5-minute endeavor. Even at the fastest chargers, it's usually on the order of 20 to 30 minutes. So that was a little shocking for some of them. A lot of people don't know what level of charge their battery should go to keep it healthy. A lot of lithium ion batteries, for example, the most common one in the market, only should be charged to 80% regularly, and only past that when you are going on a really long trip right away after charging it. But I was routinely seeing people who live 15 minutes away coming in at 87% already and trying to charge back to 100 just because they hadn't a spare moment to sit at the charging station that they wanted to spend efficiently, and didn't realize they were potentially harming their battery by doing that. There were other things like people couldn't figure out where the button was for turning off the air conditioning because it was a software button instead of a hardware one like they've been used to in gas vehicles. And just all this like sort of knowledge gap stuff where they were having problems, but they didn't know how to solve them. They didn't know who to ask. In a lot of cases, they didn't even know that there was a problem present because nothing was telling them about it. So that's part of what we built our chat interface with Selene, was to be able to answer these questions for very specific vehicles for them while they're on the road in order to save time and hopefully money and keep their vehicles healthy. But then when we started doing the fleet stuff, we realized there was a very different use case there. Typically less focused. They tend to know the vehicle a lot better, especially if they're driving it every day already. But there can be high turnover with drivers. So in some ways, you're being exposed to new drivers of EVs for the first time a lot. It depends on the company. But especially when it comes to routing, customers, individual drivers, don't go on that many road trips. That's a well-documented thing in the United States, at least. It's like, maybe 3 or 4 a year at the most. So it's a very low frequency of usage of that particular feature, which is, frankly, not a great business model. So what we said was, hey, let's keep building things for individual drivers. We know them, we understand them, we know they have pain points. but this may not be a valid path right now for monetization. So let's just give it away for free so people can see what it can do and try to use it. Not all the features, but the non-fleet ones. And then the fleet ones became our B2B model, where we are basically able to charge on a per vehicle per month subscription basis, because it takes more compute on our end to handle lots of vehicles all at once instead of just a single 1 or 2 vehicle fleet. But that's ultimately where we came up. They're using it every day. We found that fleets in particular are realizing that they can expand their service territory, as I mentioned before, significantly more by using this technology. For example, the customer I mentioned, Sustainably, is seeing about a 60% increase in their customer base, which is pretty great. And they're able to reach much, much further customers and expand their go-to-market strategy accordingly as well, all without paying more than our subscription fee. And then the other thing that we were surprised by is that when it comes to repairs of these vehicles, it can be so difficult to figure out which dealerships or service centers are the most expert when it comes to electric vehicles. And in our Sustainably's case, they actually had a situation where they got an error code on one of their vans, and they took it to their Ford dealership where they'd been purchased. And for 3 days, it was out of commission and losing revenue as a result of not being able to drive it. And by the time it came back, they unfortunately weren't able to diagnose the problem at the dealership, and it was still broken. So that's 3 days of downtime. And then they said, "Hey, what if we just feed this into Selene and see what the answer is from the AI?" And Selene, in about 30 seconds, was able to diagnose what was going wrong in plain English and provide them with the troubleshooting steps they needed out of the owner's manual to be able to fix it themselves. So they could have avoided 3 days of downtime with about 30 seconds with Selene, which was a nice value add for them that we hadn't been expecting and that we're digging deeper into now as we're discovering that use case.
Let's talk about market. Zooming out to the EV market, how big is it today and what key trends do you see shaping it over the next 3-5 years in the United States?
Well, okay, that's not fair, because when we talked about this before, you didn't say in United States at the end. So my answer is two-pronged.
Okay, up to you.
Worked on it. So as I was going to say, it's definitely a tale where it's useful to look at global, but then we are in the US right now. That's where we're operating. That's the market we know. So we do focus on US right now, although we do hope to expand into Europe in the near future. But I'm going to answer both the global and the US, and it's helpful to contrast them too. So, like I sort of alluded to earlier, you gave me a little bit of a sneak peek at the script for this call. So I was able to look up some stats and make sure they were as fresh as they could be. Right now in the globally, the CAGR, the compound annual growth rate, over the next about 4 years for the EV market is on the order of 6%, which can be compared to about 2% for all passenger vehicle types globally. So it's about 3 times that for the passenger vehicle space. For baselining, we're also expecting to see about $780 billion in revenue for EV sales globally just this year, with notably China making up almost half of that, about 48% of all sales dollars. And then globally, but especially in Europe, one major factor in the EV industry that we all talk about is the dominance in many places of Tesla, and the fact that they've actually, except for China, China tends to prefer Chinese brands, but other than that, they tend to be a very dominant brand in the rest of the world. Until this year, they've been seeing great gains in a lot of markets, but this year they've actually seen substantial losses where in terms of sales of new vehicles. So for an example, in the US, they had a peak market share of about 80% of all new EV sales back in I think 2017 with the rollout of their Model 3. But now they're down to as low as 38%, whereas last year they were doing it at about 50%. So every 2 vehicles, one of them was a Tesla, one was from another brand like a Ford or a Chrysler or whatever. All right, shifting gears, that's the global scene. But looking just at the US, before I'd mentioned there was about $780 billion in revenue for EVs, excuse me, in 2025 globally. About 100 billion of that, a little shy of 100 billion of that is in the US. There's a significantly higher growth rate projected for the US than there is globally, about 12.6%, which is more than double the global rate. That sounds really impressive, but I do think that for the US in particular, that's largely a little inflated due to the low early adopter rates we had. We kind of invented a lot of the technology for the electric vehicle ourselves in the US, but we haven't been as quick to adopt it as other countries have been. But also those numbers are somewhat subject to change, that particular growth rate, because that may have been calculated in the current era, whereas a month from now, the federal incentives for purchases of electric vehicles, commercial as well as passenger, are going to be shut off by the federal government because of the One Beautiful Bill Act. And so that might actually affect the growth number estimate for the next 3-ish years. But it's possible that's already being accounted for in forecasts. We'll just have to see how it plays out over the course of the rest of the calendar year. But even with those federal incentives getting turned off, which were about $7,500 of tax credit in the best case for a new vehicle, even with those being shut off, I still feel, and our company's advisors still feel, there's reason for optimism. Every forecast seems to indicate that electric vehicle adoption in the United States is expected, and globally especially, is expected to keep growing. It's just it was on like a very, very clear growth curve. The growth itself was growing. Now it might sort of plateau a bit and just be growing at a constant rate for a little while in the US in particular. But also another thing that I don't feel is talked about enough, the various industry periodicals or whatever, is the fact that the federal NEVI, National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure funding, was recently reinstated by the courts, such that the federal government will continue to distribute this. And that is a big deal because it's actually billions of dollars being distributed to states and ultimately to private entities, in the most part, for installing new electric charging, public electric charging. Why, obviously that's an important part of the equation. Why is that such a big deal in my mind? Is because historically the EV market has had a bit of a chicken and egg problem, where you can't decide if it makes more sense today to install more chargers to encourage more vehicles to be purchased, or figure out a way to get more vehicles purchased to encourage the charging market to install more chargers. Like, you can see how both have arguments for and against, and you can kind of often end up in analysis paralysis as an industry. What I'm kind of excited by is, with this injection of government funds continuing on for the charging side, we might for the first time be able to build overcapacity of public charging for electric vehicles that will get ahead of the adoption curve of the vehicles themselves, and potentially stop this chicken and egg dynamic and allow people to just feel confident that if they buy a vehicle, it's going to be easy to charge, and it's going to continue to be easy to charge, and charging will keep getting built out faster than the vehicles can be rolled off the assembly lines. And we can sort of get ourselves as a market a little bit more consistent with what gas vehicles see right now, where there's not usually a worry about whether there will be enough gas stations or not. The other thing on top of this is that there's actually some signals coming from major companies in this space that give me cause for intrigue about how the future of the EV industry in the US is going to continue. In particular, one major US manufacturer, Ford, has basically made a big announcement in the last month, even, I think it was, about retooling their entire assembly line theory around electric vehicles and assembling them more efficiently and with fewer parts, and building it on a standardized platform instead of a different design for every single vehicle model, to be able to speed it up and make it really, really cheap. They've even claimed that they can build a truck as cheap as a startup in this space, Slate, that's designing EV trucks to be as cheap as humanly possible, on the order of $20,000. Ford thinks they can't quite get that low, but they can get as low as $30,000, which is still more than low enough for a light-duty work truck, especially if it's got an electric vehicle battery in there. So with big players putting big bets on the industry even now, and with other signs of the industry maybe sort of shaking off its early growth roots and getting to be a little more mature with some of the government incentives that will continue to exist, I'm hopeful that we're going to keep growing, maybe even on an accelerated curve for the next few years. But anyways, hopefully that answers your question. I feel like I rattled off a lot of factoids there. I'm not sure if I actually got to the core of what you were going for.
Yes, thank you so much, Dave. And do you see Selene as just a navigator tool or something bigger?
No, we at first, that was purely the vision, was getting from A to B as efficiently and safely as possible, and that's still a core element, certainly. But along the way, in order to enable this to be a little more easy of an experience for drivers, especially, and enabling Selene's AI functionalities to be able to call out to some of these route making tools and stuff like that, just by being asked, take me from Chicago to New York or whatever, and being able to sort of do that natural language mapping sort of stuff. Along the way, we also started playing with some of these things I talked about before, related to being able to diagnose problems with the vehicle, ask detailed questions about how to do X, Y, or Z thing. And we're seeing some interest in that from our customer base as well, our user base as well, such that that's proving to be an intriguing path that we hadn't really been putting a lot of focus on before. But when you combine the power of AI and its flexibility to answer questions on the fly in whatever form you ask them, with the tooling to be able to make intelligent navigation decisions for both individuals and businesses, you're starting to see sort of an all-around software layer of interacting with your vehicle that doesn't really exist anywhere else, and that we're keen to explore further. We would love to become the company that sort of acts as a standardizing layer for how you interface with your vehicle, so that if I buy a Ford today and Cadillac or tomorrow, that I'm going to feel like it's a very similar experience and not night and day because of the types of technology they chose to integrate directly. We just want to make it so that it's easy and smooth to go into the electric transition for everybody.
Yeah. So, today I just checked when started uh, selling tickets on World Football Club, North America 2026. Yeah. And, I think in a Selene perspective, it's huge opportunities, because a lot of people will going trips between cities using EV. Yeah. And your product will be very, very useful.
Yeah, anytime people are trying to go somewhere they may never have visited before, especially, or that has historically been underserved, that's a real opportunity. The key is getting people comfortable enough with the idea of using an electric vehicle to do that in the first place. There's a lot of
Yeah.
preconceptions about what it can and can't do that lead a lot of households to have a gas vehicle that they barely use just for road trips, and an electric vehicle they use every day that they don't believe can do road trips. That's extra insurance costs, that's extra maintenance costs, that's using up extra space at home. And of course, you're not as green as you could be if your longest trips are still being done through combustion engines. So we're trying to get ahead of that as much as we can by letting people know that there's another option to do this stuff safely. And some of that is what we call guerrilla marketing. So there's some very interesting events, and I think major soccer matches in particular would qualify, that a lot of EV enthusiasts tend to rally around. One that I discovered last year that I was surprised by was solar eclipses. So there was a big path of totality for the total solar eclipse through the Midwest of the United States last year. And my wife is an astrobiologist at NASA, actually. And so she was very keen to show the kids the total solar eclipse. And my parents in my hometown were right in the path of totality in Ohio. So we took a road trip with our family in April of last year to be able to go. Was that last year or was this year? Oh, I'm getting my years mixed up. Sorry. I think that might have been this year. To go visit and see the eclipse. And it was astonishing because it was a route we've done many times before with our EV, but we had to wait in line pretty much everywhere we stopped for charging that we'd never had to wait before, because all these EV drivers were excited to go see the path of totality, and they were overtaxing the charging system as a result. I think that's an interesting scenario where we see these surge events at electric vehicle charging stations that only happen a few times a year. But when they do happen, they're a really big problem because, I mean, imagine being the third person in line for a charger when every charge takes at least 30 minutes. Right there, you're just waiting an hour and a half before you even get to start, 2 hours total before you get to leave. That's not really an ideal scenario, which is why part of our underlying algorithm actually maximizes for speed of charge as well as how many chargers, how many plugs are available at a given station, so that we can send you to the places with the highest probability that you'll get to be served right away, even if it's not always perfectly successful. Hopefully that answers. I mean, I think you're right though. Any large scale migration event, if you will, is a really interesting opportunity. The real key for our space is how do we get ahead of that so that people seriously consider an electric vehicle transit option instead of dismissing it immediately and assuming it's impossible.
Yeah. And final question for market. What benchmarks are you setting for yourself in terms of market coverage?
What benchmarks are we setting for market coverage? Well, I think it's largely a function of what geographies we're playing in. So of course we're using the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area as a starting point for a lot of stuff where we can directly interact. We are trying to focus on getting at least 1,000 free users by the end of calendar year, as well as at least 5 fleet businesses signed up and paying by the same time period. Currently trying different marketing channels and outreach mechanisms to try and pull that off. I'll let you know on January 1st how well that goes, but we've been basically benchmarking against various lookalike app and software growths. Although I'm proud to say there's really no product we can directly one-to-one say we're mimicking, which is obviously the point. If we were just a copy of someone else's product, I wouldn't be able to talk as confidently about what we do. But yeah, we're trying to use sort of growth curves that exist in the SaaS space for the commercial side, as well as in the navigation and chat space for the free user non-commercial side.
Mm-hmm. And what is your go-to-market strategy?
Depends on which market. So as I've said, we're trying to sort of serve two masters, if you will, right now. One being the individual private drivers, and the other being the fleets. We use prospecting tools like Apollo, for example, to try and identify high intent individuals, organizations within the small to medium business fleet space. We also attend transportation conferences whenever possible, and have started trying to leverage go-to-market partnerships with our earliest customers. Since they tend to be in the sustainability space as well, they have a lot of customers of their own who are very keen to already be electric or be on the path to electrification of their own vehicles. So trying to also work that. Major event we're going to be at in a couple of weeks now is New York City's Climate Week, which is at the last full week of September. If this goes out before then, which I think it will, and anybody sees this that's going to be in New York for Climate Week, feel free to look me up. It shouldn't be too hard to find. I have a really weird last name, and I would love to meet up.
Yeah, definitely. So, Dave, let's talk about team. Who is on your team today, and how big is it?
It's a very, very lean team. So it's just myself and my co-founder, CTO. We both are coming from the AI engineering space. So that's part of why we're able to spin up our tech as fast as we can. My co-founder, Yusuf, is also focused, has an experience in the automotive space, having worked at Ford in the past as a test engineer. So knows a lot of the ins and outs of that space and the electric vehicle manufacturing process and things along those lines. And yeah, still a fairly small bootstrap team, looking for enough traction to justify that nice pre-seed round.
Yeah. And what do you personally see as the most important factor for effective teamwork in your startup?
Ah, that's an interesting question. So I've been blessed in my career to have had an opportunity to lead a lot of teams, to also collaborate with other leaders to try and build partnerships in business as well as in personal life. And for me, what I've found is radical transparency is probably the best you can do. So there's platforms out there that I've used and others have used for like finding co-founders to work with you on a startup idea that you've never met before. And I think there's value to that, no question. And I'm sure for some people it works out. But the old adage I'd heard before, and then I ended up living, was that you really need to work with and co-found with people you already know very well, if from work, if not from your personal life. And you need to know that you've got that collaborative chemistry, that understanding, that willingness to be honest without having feelings being hurt, that sort of thing has to all already be there in order to be an effective team. And so one thing we focused a lot on was saying at day one, when we started the company, like, we need to be willing to be up in each other's business as much as possible. We need to understand that is not prying. That's not us being overly curious or sticking our noses in where they don't belong. That's just us needing to know what the other person's situation is so we can adapt and pivot as needed. So sometimes our part-time gigs might require a bigger focus in our day than they have prior to that. And we have to tell the other person, hey, I'm going to be rolling off of this part of the company for a little bit so that I can focus more on my other gig. Can you spin up that part as much as possible so that you can sort of take over the slack for this time period? You know, we're very honest and we look forward as much as possible. And we have conversations like, hey, I thought you were going to be done with this by Tuesday. It's Thursday now and it's still not done. I've got this customer discovery call tomorrow where I wanted to use it in the demo. What are we going to do? How are we going to make this work? And usually the answer is, let's build a really rough and tumble version as fast as possible. I did a demo a few weeks ago for a tech meetup where I was literally pushing to Maine right before I jumped on a scooter to drive over there and like do the demo. So sometimes that sort of hair-raising last-minute stuff is necessary and it can be really, really important to have someone you trust implicitly on the other side of the phone or the Zoom call or in the co-working space or whatever. As long as you've got that trust and that sort of natural team chemistry that you're willing to be very open and clear and think ahead and all that, then I think you can be successful. But that's hard to do with someone you've met for the first time in the context of co-founding.
Yeah, and you have a PhD and you work in science. What's the difference between scientist and entrepreneur?
That's an interesting question. Uh, I would say so. Scientists, because they do research and development, they're not expecting. They shouldn't be, if they're doing their job well, expecting a particular outcome from doing an experiment or a study or whatever. Like the whole point is finding out if the outcome that they hypothesized is true, and of course, ideally being open to being proven wrong. In that regard, there's a lot of similarities where we have to be willing to go into a conversation with a potential customer as an entrepreneur and be proven, have all of our beliefs about what the market's problems are and how we're going to fix them be proven wrong, and pivot in the moment to asking the hard questions about like what would be a useful thing. Can we come up with something on this phone call real quick that helps us find a real solution path? I think in that regard, there might be a little more thinking on your feet required for an entrepreneur than there tends to be for a scientist. Scientists like to do a lot of the pre-work really deeply before they ever present to an audience, months of research and writing and presenting drafts to your research team before you ever go and present it to like a conference or something like that, as opposed to thinking on your feet as much. I would also say the biggest difference, the thing I still struggle with today, I'll freely admit, is the cold outreach stuff you have to do all the time as an entrepreneur, right? Like any validation, even if you happen to come from a business sector that you are going to be targeting as your customer base, you're probably going to exhaust your own network fairly quickly before you've fully validated your idea. And so there's going to be a lot of trying to, interview people at charging stations that have never met you before. And hopefully you don't look too skeevy when you approach them, making people feel like their time isn't being wasted. Figuring out how to do, if absolutely necessary, cold emails and maybe even cold calls, depending upon what your sales strategy is. All of those soft skill things that require you to both aggressively pursue people that you need to talk to, who you have not necessarily been warmly introduced to by a third party. Those are new and difficult skills to master when coming from a research background, where your research advisor usually knows everybody else's research advisor in your space. You've got a built-in network from that you then piggyback off of for the rest of your career, probably, as opposed to having to build a network for the thing you're trying to do as an entrepreneur from the ground up with very little foundational connections to work with from the beginning. So that's a huge difference, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, what's one piece of advice you would give to someone starting their first startup today?
So it's very aligned with what I just said, and not really what I did, although I wish I had had the opportunity to do it, which is, the guidance I've heard from places like Y Combinator Startup School, for example, which for anybody watching this who hasn't checked it out yet, it's free. I highly recommend it. It's a great place to go to do some online learning about what it takes to be a startup founder and how to think about it for yourself in your own situation. But one thing they talk a lot about that I fully agree with is, don't assume that because you've said today, Monday, I'm going to be a startup founder, that's when your startup begins. That's not really the case. That's when you are saying to yourself, I'm going to adopt an entrepreneurial mindset. And then you have to sort of just, what that means to me is keeping your eyes open for problems and trying to figure out, okay, is this a problem I expect a lot of people are facing and that I think I can see a path towards fixing in a useful way that people might want to pay for? And once you've found what you think to be that hypothesis, which can take days, weeks, months, maybe years, depending upon what you're exposed to in your daily life, that's when you've got the kernel of something that's worth really chasing after and chasing down. And that's when you start the customer pain point discovery, customer validation process. How you do that is totally dependent on your idea and the audience, the customer base you're serving. But that's the moment when you need to do the switch over, in my opinion. And anyways, that's very broad guidance. It works. It's how I did it. It's great. Start with a real problem you see. Don't force a problem to come into existence just because you have a cool solution you want to work on, but wait for the problem to reach you and Make sure you feel that pain before you get started. The only thing I'd add to the top of that, on top of that advice, the thing that I didn't do as well, is ideally make this be make the discovery process part of your work, like what job you have right then and there. Because if you're discovering pain points that are part of your day job while you're trying to start a company of your own, or thinking about doing so, you're probably going to discover pain points specific to your industry that later will mean you're going to have a much more robust professional network to rely on for pain point validation and eventual sales. Not having that foundational network and having to build all of that from the ground up can be a bear. And for us, we realized that when we realized we needed to pivot from a pure B2C product to a B2B product, and we needed to establish a lot more of those fleet relationships. We're still figuring out the best recipe for making those consistent pipelines of validation and eventually sales work out. And if we had been in the fleets business the moment we had the idea and had a lot of connections from having done that for someone else's company, it would be a far more straightforward approach to spinning things up.
Dave, thanks for sharing your story. It was awesome.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.